the Russians are making advances, but I think the Ukrainians are trading a bit of space for time, because rather than holding it hard and suffering large numbers of casualties of personnel, equipment and everything else, it's easier to hold for a bit, withdraw slowly, fight a defensive battle whenever you're attriting the enemy so much more. So the Russians have lost since January an average of 966 troops a day, 20 plus tanks, 20 plus pieces of artillery and all the rest of it. Their defence industrial base can't keep up with replacing that. They have replaced a lot of the stuff that they lost in the first 18 months of the conflict, but even at the rates they're losing at the minute, they can't keep that up. So that's hollowing the Russian forces out.
First of all, do you accept the premise that the momentum can swing back to Ukraine?
Oh, very much so. The momentum was with Ukraine the whole of last year, and it only whenever their counteroffensive sort of hit the roadblocks did the momentum start to slowly swing at a tactical level from a one-dimensional perspective. I'll caveat at that, back in Russia's favour, where Russia is now gaining small elements of territory.
So let's talk this through stage by stage. Obviously, at the moment, we are seeing Russia making advances, notably in Kharkiv, Oblast. Yep. What needs to happen in order to limit those advances?
Well, this is where Ukraine needs the wherewithal to be able to halt the Russians. I think the Russians are making advances, but I think the Ukrainians are trading a bit of space for time, because rather than holding it hard and suffering large numbers of casualties of personnel, equipment and everything else, it's easier to hold for a bit, withdraw slowly, fight a defensive battle whenever you're attriting the enemy so much more. So the Russians have lost since January an average of 966 troops a day, 20 plus tanks, 20 plus pieces of artillery and all the rest of it. Their defence industrial base can't keep up with replacing that. They have replaced a lot of the stuff that they lost in the first 18 months of the conflict, but even at the rates they're losing at the minute, they can't keep that up. So that's hollowing the Russian forces out and trading a bit of territory. That territory is not strategically significant. It's largely been unoccupied by the local people, and therefore the Ukrainians know that they can take it back whenever they've got the weapon systems and the military wherewithal to be able to halt the Russians, turn them around and push them back. That's the next step.
And as Zelensky has said time and again, you know, they need more air defences, more air defence interceptors in order to protect, for example, Kharkiv city.
Yeah, well, the two elements to that. One, to protect the cities and protect the critical national infrastructure. We've seen that start to get hit, and that's only in the last couple of months. Before that, the Ukrainians were knocking out at least 96% of all Russian attacks. Now they're only been able to knock out 60-70%. That's down to lack of air defence missiles, down to lack of ammunition for their air defence guns and everything else. That's where the critical the aid package from the United States and from Europe, because it's not all US air defence missiles, is critical, and that's where that needs to flow in quickly and is starting to come in. The second bit is to be able to then take that air defence without denuding what you've got over your cities and over your critical national infrastructure, but to take an air defence bubble and put it over the front line somewhere, so that you're protecting your land forces from the new weapon that is having maximum effect, the new Russian weapon, which are the glide bombs. You know, an artillery shell has got 10, 15, 20 kilograms of high explosives in it. The glide bombs have got 500,000 kilograms of high explosives in them. That, when it hits a defensive position, people don't survive, they don't get out. Whereas your defensive positions are built to withstand artillery attacks, they can't withstand that. So until Ukrainians can push that threat back, and that's the only way to do that, is that air defense bubble. We've seen them practice by trying to have Patriot missile ambush sites where they've successfully shot down a number of Russian aircraft, but that's left the Patriot missile batteries very vulnerable indeed. Until they can get something to protect that, then that's a very dangerous position to be in. And the bit that we're waiting for to get that air defence bubble are the infamous F-16s, with the right weapon systems, with the pilots properly trained to use them. And I think it's shown the complexity of it, that those pilots have been training now for 6, 7, 8, 9 months. It takes a lot of time, and a lot of those are experienced pilots. It takes a lot of time to take your experienced pilots and not just teach them how to fly a new aircraft, but to fight the aircraft. There's no point in flying it if you can't fight it, and to fight it with all the different weapon systems on it and how they all come together, because the last thing you want is to get these new shiny they're 20-plus-year-old aircraft, but or older. But compared to what they've got, new shiny aircraft, and you lose half a dozen on your first 2 or 3 sorties. So they have to be in a position where they can use them from a confidence perspective, and it's creating that bubble. Once the Ukrainians are confident they can create that air defence bubble over the parts of the front line that they want to have an effect on, then we'll see things changing.
I'm glad you mentioned the F-16s because they are eagerly anticipated.
Yeah.
Could they be the kind of thing that does shift the momentum back in Ukraine's favour?
Very much so. I think they are key, and I think that's why the Russians made their move on Kharkiv, where the Russians are prosecuting their operations quite hard on the front line through the rest of the front line. The front line's enormous, 1,200 plus kilometres. I think the whole of the British military would have difficulty dealing with less than 10% of that if we deployed everything we've got. So that the scale is enormous. But the Russians saw this very small window of opportunity before the Western ammunition came in, before the F-16s came in, and they know that they will push their ability to fly their fixed-wing aircraft with those glide bombs on, push them back and possibly out of range of affecting the front line. And that's where the Russians went for it, as well as splitting the Ukrainian reserve forces so that the Russians would be facing less protection on the front lines elsewhere. They haven't exploited that properly, but that's what we've seen beforehand. Even if the Ukrainians, their defences are weakened down because they don't have the resources there, the Russians haven't been able to properly exploit them. I think Ukraine, from an innovation perspective, they've torn up all of the doctrine manuals that we've had, and the West is looking at Ukraine and going, oh my goodness, crikey, they're teaching us so much. So the FPV drones, the way they used the NLAW missiles when the Russians first came in, and the Javelin anti-tank missiles and everything else, the way they're setting up different ambushes around the place. We haven't seen the Ukrainians use heavy armour in a massed perspective yet, but you can't do that until you get that air defence bubble around it. But there is an awful lot of innovation. The big area that they're innovating in that we had forgotten completely about is what I call at the operational level. Now, the tactical level, i.e. the front line, the fighting that's going on there, relies on the operational level to set the conditions for that, so to make sure that you've got the safe environment for supplies to come in, your reserves to build up and be prepared, new equipment to come in, etc., etc., etc. And the Ukrainians are having a massive effect in attacking Russian oil production facilities, their manufacturing capabilities, defence manufacturing capabilities, air defence bubbles that they have around their bases and stuff before there's then a Ukrainian attack in, and attacking their morale as well by, we've seen 30 to 50% of the Black Sea fleet, the final missile carrying ship has been sunk, or allegedly has been sunk. That's having a massive morale effect, a massive command and control effect, and therefore is hollowing the Russians out from behind. And we're seeing the Ukrainians giving us a real masterclass in doing that. And within that, they're using long-range drones. They're using converted light aircraft into long-range suicide drones. They're bringing in a lot of new technologies that haven't quite hit the headlines yet in helping them do that sort of thing. But they're going back to the good old-fashioned tactics of sabotage and you're getting people on the ground to work for them. And that's causing the Russians some very, very real headaches. I can see that growing in its effort as the Ukrainians recognise they're ready to prepare for taking the initiative back on the front line again.
And one of the things we're hearing a lot of calls for now is for Ukraine to be allowed to use Western supplied weapons behind Russian lines. And okay, you've heard noises from David Cameron, for example, and even Annalena Baerbock, the German foreign minister, saying that they should move in that direction, but the US still very much saying no, not at the moment.
Yeah.
Is a shift in that position a prerequisite of Ukraine regaining momentum, do you think?
The only country that I'm aware of that's not allowing it to happen with our weapons at the minute is the United States. Why the United States is being so fixed, I'm not sure. Because the Russians are launching a large number of their attacks that's affecting the tactical operation from within inside Russian territory. Europeans, French, Germans, I think, haven't put a complete ban on it. The Brits are supporting and have put statements out to support Ukrainians using British weapons. And I know Ukrainians are using British weapons inside Russia to very, very good effect. The trouble is, what they need are those weapons that can be used at concentrations of troops much better, and those are the American supplied longer range ATACMS missiles and bits and pieces. So whenever the Russians concentrate their artillery across the border in Russia but are firing into the offensive operations that they're carrying on in Kharkiv, the Ukrainians can't attack them with the sort of mass that you'd want. They'd have to put an awful lot of effort and move that from other parts of the front line, leaving other parts of the front line more vulnerable. And this is where, if the Americans allowed them to use the American weapons across there, it would stop the Russians being able to exploit this safe territory for them, or almost safe territory. The indications to me suggest that the Ukrainians aren't as concerned about that militarily as they're saying publicly, and we have to remember information and the way it's put out is a key part of this operation. I always remember Sun Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher and general, in his book The Art of War, said all warfare is deception, all deception is warfare. I'm paraphrasing, but that's 6th century, and he's right. So a lot of the statements that we're hearing out of people will be designed to have an effect one way or the other to influence how operations are going. If the Ukrainians were really concerned, we wouldn't see them flying capabilities to hit oil fields and to hit other bits and pieces around much deeper inside Russia. We'd see them concentrating on those bits that are affecting the tactical operations on the front line. I haven't quite seen that yet. So they're right to raise their concerns. They need to be able to use those weapons. If they can do, that'll help the Ukrainians regain the initiative again in a much quicker way. But it's politics, and that's the trouble with politics and where it goes. And of course, war is diplomacy by other means, so they're all linked.
A lot of analysts say fundamentally the way to hurt Vladimir Putin and to get him on the back foot making concessions is to go after Crimea. If you look at, for example, the Kerch Bridge, what would it take to destroy the Kerch Bridge? I mean, people talk about maybe if Germany provides Taurus missiles, they could be used against the Kerch Bridge.
Yeah, Taurus missiles can. There's a number of different solutions that can. If they can get the Storm Shadows within range, and again, you get the F-16s in, that can provide an air bubble around an attack package going in with Storm Shadow or Scalp, which is the same missile but the French equivalent, into an area where they can launch them at the Kerch Bridge, then that's distinctly possible. There's that magic F-16 again, that air defence bubble around things. That's the key to everything. So there's a number of weapon systems that they could use to attack Kerch Bridge. The Russians close it every now and again because they see the threat that's coming in, and they could go back to the good old truck bomb or some form of some equivalent in that. The Ukrainian SOE operations are their initiative is fantastic. They don't need to close it at the minute because I believe that they think that doing that will be a clear indicator for what they're going to do elsewhere and will cause the Russians to get more prepared across the whole of the front line. So they're keeping that up their sleeve. Ideally, they want as many different weapon systems that gives them the options to close it in different ways, and ideally destroy it and take it down. But the Ukrainians are concentrating quite a lot on Crimea at the moment. Their attacks on the 6th Fleet, their attacks on air defence, and then those have been backed up with attacks on airfields, and they're trying to deny the use of the airfields in Crimea. A lot of those airfields have been used to launch the fixed-wing aircraft that have got the glide bombs on them. There's a bit of preparation going on at the moment, so the indications are that Ukraine is starting to prepare the battle space, but it's a long and very deliberate effort for what's going to be an exceptionally complex operation. And
away from the front line, are there other things we should be looking out for in terms of ways that Ukraine can take the fight to Russia? I mean, it was interesting recently, the Times were reporting how Ukrainian special forces are actually involved on the ground in Sudan, where there's all manner of conflict at the moment because Russia also has a presence there and is trying to use smuggled gold to fund the Russian war effort against Ukraine. So are there other things we should be looking out for here?
There are. I think they're going to be difficult to look out for. Russia has got its fingers in so many different pies around the world. It relies on the sort of para-criminal or pseudo-criminal enterprises, or completely criminal enterprises, that has got throughout Africa and elsewhere to fund the oligarchs who are funding what Putin's doing from a war machine and all the rest of it. We're also seeing levels of political support, and this increasing alliance between Russia, China, North Korea and Iran is really worrying. And I don't think this is necessarily up to Ukraine to deal with that. I think this is up to the wider international community to deal with that, because that's a much bigger threat for everyone, not including Ukraine. Is there anything that Ukraine can do specifically themselves? I think just keep doing what they're doing and making sure that they're continuing to get the Western support, because at the minute, Ukraine in their tactical fight and their operational fight with the Russians are protecting us in Europe and those in the rest of the free, as we describe as the free world. If Ukraine loses, then the financial cost to us is going to be phenomenal, because there'll be a new Cold War. During the last Cold War, defence budgets were at 6 to 7% of GDP. Our governments are bulking at 2.5%. Our talk of 3%. And if Russia wins even more, then Russia will prepare to go elsewhere. But if Russia's allowed to win, you'll get other nations like China will turn around and go, okay, so if we attacked and took Taiwan by force, we only have to wait 3 or 4 years until the Western political hiatus collapses completely and we've got away with it. So can we afford that? Let's prepare our financial coffers to do that, and that's what we'll do. And it'll stimulate more uncertainty and more instability around the world. That would then have a massive effect on our economies as well. Most of the world's semiconductors are made in, or the microchips are made in Taiwan. If there's a war in there, just think of the impact that would have on our global economies. It's unbearable, and that's just the start of it.
Assuming Ukraine can do all the things we've discussed in the coming months over the course of 2024, where and when does a Ukrainian counteroffensive take place?
I think 2024, what we'll see is Ukraine stabilising the front line, continuing their operational level, special operations of executive type attacks behind, but increasing those to have a greater effect. As they then start to practice putting those little air defence bubbles around to scare the Russians, push their fixed-wing aircraft further back. But they'll do that over a number of different places in the front lines. The Russians don't quite know where the Ukrainian main effort will come in. We'll then see Ukrainian attacks in different parts of the front line to keep the Russian reserves split, so they don't know where to concentrate on, and potentially reinforcement of the Ukrainian bridgehead that they've got across the Dnipro down at Kherson, or potentially a commando type raid into Crimea and capture a toehold of territory there, knowing the Russians would have to move ground forces to try and deal with that, and the psychological impact that would have. After that, we then see more logistic routes being interdicted, railway lines, the Kiev Bridge. That's the time to remove the Kiev Bridge, and then put an air defence bubble over the part of the ground where you're going to have a proper armoured effect. But before that armoured effect, I'd see the Ukrainians using their bomber aircraft to bomb the defensive positions and the minefields and all the rest of it, that they're going to put their ground engineers through to prepare that. The last time we came across that was during the Gulf War, and the Western Allies bombed the Iraqi defensive positions for over 30 days to try and weaken those defensive positions before they put engineers through on the ground. Ukrainians haven't been able to do that yet, and the defensive positions they're fighting through are stronger than we've seen in any conflict ever, including the Second World War. So they need to do that, and then once that's happened, that's when the ground force is going to go in.
Just finally, Philip, do you think there's a risk that we are becoming too pessimistic about Ukraine's chances? And perhaps that's because we've forgotten some of the fundamentals, that yes, okay, it's been a very difficult 6 months and more Western support is needed, etc., etc. However, given what Vladimir Putin's objectives were at the start of 2022, given where Russia is now, Russia has failed in those objectives. And do you think we lose sight of that sometimes?
I think we do. From a commentary perspective, Russia has failed strategically. It's failed to dislocate the Zelensky government, to capture Kyiv, to put a puppet government in, to have Ukraine as a puppet of Russia in the same way that Belarus is. That's what they wanted. They wanted to stop NATO expansionism. NATO's grown by 2 countries since this has happened. Russia has been tactically pushed back from huge swathes of territory to focus in the east. Yes, they're having a little bit of success in what's going on, but I see that as Ukraine trading space for time, as I've said beforehand. And now Russia's gone back to what Russia always does and try to get into an attritional war to make it as long as possible, to get Ukraine fatigue into the West, because they understand Western politics and how that can set in. And that's what we're seeing, Ukraine fatigue coming in. So Putin is exploiting that more and more. The best thing we can do is redouble our support and our effort for Ukraine and embolden Ukraine to continue to protect us, because that's what they're doing. They are sacrificing their lives to protect us.
To begin with, I wanted to get your thoughts on some comments we've had recently from President Zelensky. Given the advances we've been seeing Russia making in Kharkiv Oblast in the northeast of Ukraine, is Zelensky right to call for NATO to become more directly involved in this conflict? In particular, should NATO allies be prepared to shoot down Russian missiles?
James, it's a slippery slope. Our nation, the NATO nations, have been very, very careful to do all they can to support Ukraine without getting into a dust-up, without getting, without fighting Russians. And people get killed, and this thing rapidly escalates. Saying that, what must be done to ensure, or do everything we can to ensure that Ukraine is enabled both materially and with morale and moxie to continue this grinding, awful fight where they have been extraordinary in the last, good God, can you believe it? It's been 15 months. So this is hard. I'm one that believes now that we need to take our gloves off as far as letting the Ukrainians fire into Russia with whatever systems that they are provided. And there are some out there that are intrigued by the thought of not going in to engage the Russians, but to set up, as we talked about in 2022, a no-fly and no-drive zone. And maybe that line is the Dnieper River, the Dnipro, giving the Ukrainians the ability to fight with their full resources along that 600-mile front, which is a formidable task, especially when you are in a meat grinder situation. At that point, it comes down to if there's something along that line with NATO, but it would probably be a coalition of the willing, because I can't see NATO at 31 supporting that. Then you go public and say, we are here up to this line. We're not going beyond, to backstop, to support our Ukrainian partners, our friends who are under a beyond the pale 17 months of continued aggression, where the violence of such is every bit now as bad as day one of the invasion. And the thing you throw back at the Russians is you lay it out to the world, and we will say, we could say we will go to this line, we will stop. Russia, it's your choice. We don't want to fight. We don't want to do this. We don't want to get into a situation where we engage the Russians, and the Russians know it. And they're playing their brinksmanship, and they're playing their nuclear brinksmanship, and they're throwing out their threats. They said just a week or two ago that they'll hit UK if when David Cameron was there and talking about doing all they can to support Ukraine. So James, this is hard stuff. I would rather not go down these paths, but can we whatever we call ourselves, the free-minded West world, the free-minded world, it's not just the West, see Ukraine fall.
I wanted to get your thoughts on what we've been seeing in Russia in the past few weeks, in particular the changes in the Russian Ministry of Defense, and with Andrei Belyasov becoming the new defense minister, and the way the Kremlin appears to be trying to really sort of bring together the economy with the war economy, I suppose you could say, the private economy with the war economy, and putting potentially Russia onto a permanent war footing. It's an argument that some analysts have been advancing now, that you are seeing Russia moving towards a permanent war footing. Do you agree with that?
We've heard the term that Mark Galeotti threw out there, Russia and Putin's forever war. And clearly, Putin and Russia, with Russia, have put Russia on an existential thinking basis in a way that the West, I don't think, fully comprehends. And Putin has made this now a struggle for Russia's existence, its principles and mores, its people, its land, the Western threat, and a lot of this narrative is the narrative that Stalin adopted when the Nazis invaded in 1941, and then all of a sudden he started to call out patriotic Russia, patriotic Soviet Union, and Putin and the regime is playing all those patriotic terms and decadent NATO and the corrupt West and U.S. led CIA anti-Russian cabal, so they have moved psychologically first, and they're now materially working toward that into more of a war footing. And that goes with the Andrei Belyasov, the new Minister of Defense, who is a civilian, I guess you'd call technocrat, that has been in the system and has Putin's trust. Replaced, I think, increasingly the figurehead Shoigu, who I think was frankly overmatched by all this, and had not been a very, very good war leader. And then a whole bunch of sackings. I mean, they fired the deputy Mindef, Timur Ivanov, for corruption. Arrested him. And then another was Deputy Minister of Defense Alexander Fomin, who we knew in our time as a officer working on the General Staff, Ministry of Defense in Moscow. What is extraordinary is that I came to Moscow in 2012, in the summer of 2012. And at that time, just 2 months afterwards, Anatoly Serdyukov, the Russian Minister of Defense, was fired, moved on for corruption. And in came Shoigu, Sergei, and General Valery Gerasimov. And until a couple weeks ago, they had been there for 12 years. That doesn't happen in any country in the West. The Russians are significantly better than they were. Ukrainians are better than they are, but they have adapted. There's nothing like getting beaten up and your nose punched and you survive to learn and survive. And so you do have a basis of trained veteran Russian troops, though the overwhelming majority still are raw conscripts, raw recruits that are being fed into this charnel house now that was Avdiivka, and now being in the fights now, these awful fights around Kharkiv, in Lysky and Volochansk. So it just goes on. Last thing, the technology. it's getting, in many ways, with all the high tech, it's getting more viscerally brutal on the elemental way, and we've seen just again the brute force on force artillery and shells and and all that we've talked about, these awful glide bombs that we're hearing about, that, you know, a Su-2035 or Su-2034 can, out of range, launch them from 50 kilometers away, and with some basic GLONASS satellite comms can get pretty close to a target. It's sort of like a cruise missile bomb, a ton. And when you drop, you know, they were used around Divka, and then it's certainly right, you know, Volochansk. This is crushing to defenders in the trenches and everything else in the cities. And I just try to think about what it must be like for the Ukrainian fighter, where a lot of them can't be replaced. You mean they're there, and the rotation system has gotten a lot harder and harder because there are not as many troops to come in, and they've had to call up 25-year-olds who are trying to save the youth of Ukraine. Most of the fighters on Ukrainian active duty, if you can believe, in the fronts are between 40 and 43 years old. Can you believe that? So this is a grind, and it goes on over time, and I think that's part of Putin's strategy. It's going to wear them down. And at what point is there, in their minds, though we don't see it anytime soon, do the Ukrainians actually start to break? Because this is as desperate of defense, sustained defense, that we've seen in modern times.
Now, Michael, you've been in New York for an annual media conference focusing on Ukraine. News reporting has concentrated recently on the Russian incursions and advances in the Kharkiv region. Now, the Ukrainian military have complained consistently they might have been able to do more to defend themselves against those attacks had they been allowed to fire NATO-supplied weapons into Russian territory, like ATACMS, for example. If and when that ban is lifted, because there is a report in the New York Times that may be imminent, how significant is it?
Sure. Good to be with you. Well, I think it does fall in the category of a game changer, because Ukraine has long since the start of the war claimed that it needs to have the capability to strike legitimate military targets deep inside Russia. The kind of, you know, military bases where those long-range missiles that are destroying Kharkiv and other Ukrainian cities day in and day out are launched from. So there's also a kind of eagerness in Ukraine to take out bigger targets like the Kerch Strait Bridge, which a lot of the military supplies comes over that. Up until now, they've been managing to poke holes into it, so to speak. But this is a big deal. I think up until now, there's been a nervousness in Western capitals about Ukraine's strike capability deeper inside Russia, because, you know, there's fears that this would prompt more retaliation from Russia. Well, we can't have a war like this where the party being attacked is like a David and Goliath fight, you know, where Ukraine has one arm kind of tied behind its back. So longer range and more powerful warheads will give Ukraine a huge capability, and I think finally will act as a deterrent as well, because the time has come where this cannot be sustained, that Ukrainian cities, especially energy infrastructure, is being attacked day in and day out. Kyiv needs the capability to take those out.
And it's the fear of escalation that's held back such a move so far. Russia has renewed its threat that it will retaliate, it says, on British targets if Ukraine uses British weapons to strike Russian territory. That's after remarks made by the Foreign Secretary David Cameron, suggesting he saw it as legitimate. How seriously should those threats be taken?
Well, I think the big fears in Western capitals, including in London, is that if things do escalate, Mr. Putin will be tempted to follow through on his threat to use tactical nuclear weapons. But we just spoke, my Global Impact show co-host and I, Melissa Ritchie, the other day with Ukraine's top diplomat to the UN, Sergei Koslitsa, and his thinking, he made this point very, very clearly that should Mr. Putin reach for those types of weapons, he will be annihilated within half a day. Even if it doesn't happen, China will draw a red line and tell Moscow not to take that route. So I think we're now seeing Western leaders get over that fear. I think they've come to realize that Mr. Putin is quite the con man when he makes threats to use nuclear weapons or strike Western targets. He's not the strong man that he projects himself inside of Russia, and I think they're coming to realize that.
Because a naval ship was sunk just days ago in Sevastopol, according to British intelligence, using precision attackers. And there's been no serious escalation yet. All we've seen is apparent tactical nuclear weapons exercises in Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. So empty threats, do you think that's proof that these threats are empty?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've said this many times on air. I think Ukrainian officials, as well as Western leaders who are pleading with taxpayers to give them the ability to fund the war in Ukraine, have to make the argument much, much, much stronger that, look, this is a real deal that we're getting in terms of arming Ukraine. For 3%, let's say, of the annual U.S. military budget, Ukraine has been able to destroy about 50% of conventional Russian military capability. And above and beyond that, they managed to destroy about 30% of the Black Sea fleet and also force the Russians to move ships from Sevastopol to safer waters, hence opening up crucial grain corridors for the world market. So I think if this message begins to get through to Western audiences, I think leaders will have an easier job selling this aid to Ukraine.
And just how much attention do the battlefield and political developments get in the US at the moment?
Sadly, it's falling off the radar quite a bit. I mean, with the elections coming up in November, lots of coverage of Trump's daily charades in the courtrooms. The Israel-Gaza conflict. It's tough to keep that type of a story in the headlines. But, as you referenced at the top, we just had a Ukrainian journalism conference here in New York City. And a lot of the analysts there said Ukraine has to do a kind of better job to humanize the story. Who are the Ukrainians above and beyond those fighting at the front line? And what do they stand for? And also personalizing stories is very important as well. So I think if the Ukrainians and outlets can do more of that type of coverage, the message will get further to Western audiences.
There is right now harrowing footage filmed by drone coming out of the town of Vovchansk, some 45 miles from Kharkiv. It's been heavily bombed, with soldiers being sent, Russian soldiers being sent in relentlessly to replace those that have been killed. It's being razed to the ground, bodies in the streets. How urgent is that situation to get that out, people to see that, and to stop it suffering the same kind of fate as Mariupol, for example? Yeah,
it's so heartbreaking to see this, and what we're seeing playing out in places like Mariupol and Kharkiv Oblast is what Ambassador Koslitsa told us the other day, is that the destruction is on a level far, far worse than, for example, what the Nazis did in their advance into Eastern Europe, where it's scorched earth tactics. And right now, Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine, a center of politics, of learning, and of culture, is being very, very badly hit. The one kind of piece of the story we can't really put together yet is a few months ago, actually in February, when President Zelensky gave his 2-year press conference, he was asked by the Ukrainian media, so what of all of these millions of dollars that were supposed to go to building defenses to stop the advance of the Russians? And he said, well, it's being deployed, it's being worked on. But as the BBC reported just a few days ago, there were pockets where Russian troops just walked over the Ukrainian-Russia border with no kind of lines of defense whatsoever. So I've also read comments by some Ukrainian military commanders that where did these millions of dollars go that were meant to build these defenses? So what Ambassador Kyslytsya also told us is if Kharkiv is going to be properly defended, they need a minimum of 2 Patriot missile batteries immediately. That's the other thing that we can't really put together here is why is this aid that was approved already quite some time ago, why is it taking so long to get into Ukrainian hands?
The need indeed is absolutely desperate. How long do you think Russia will or can sustain this kind of onslaught, though?
Well, the argument has to be made, and again, Ambassador Kyslytsya made this very clear, is that actually it's the first time a Ukrainian official has said this. He said that, and again, this is Ukraine's top diplomat to the United Nations, he said that the Russian economy has shown a resilience that none of us had expected. The replacement, for example, of the Minister of Defense from Shoigu, who is known for siphoning money very, very badly out of the defense system, has been replaced by a technocrat economist who is probably going to make this kind of military economy even stronger and more resilient. Sanctions have limited shelf life. The best ones probably have a year and a half at best. And the Russians have been able to do great workarounds with the help of former Soviet states, Uzbekistans and Kazakhstans of the world, as well as allies like India and China, who are buying Russian oil and other energy products. So it's a big concern. My view on this is that when it comes to the point where the average Russian, or especially the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg, if they really feel the bite of sanctions, they feel the isolation, they won't be able to travel to Dubai and the Maldives and elsewhere, that's when the kind of rubber hits the road and there'll be much, much more pressure on Mr. Putin to do something, perhaps even bring an end to the war.
And on the subject of money, there was a meeting in Italy this week of G7 finance ministers. It's expected to discuss the legality of handing an extra 30 billion euros in seized Russian state assets by way of a loan to Ukraine to help reconstruct or buy arms. Yet again, it's very, very slow progress in trying to release any of this money that's been seized. But could it make a significant difference and set a precedent?
Absolutely. And we have to remind everyone that the bulk of that money, those seized sovereign funds from Russia, is in Europe. It's not here in the United States or in Canada. So it's very important that the Belgians, especially, which are hosting Euroclear, pave the way for at least the interest from those billions of frozen dollars to go to Ukraine. And I think this is the way things have to go, because if you take talk to the average person here in the United States about the war in Ukraine, they have other concerns on their mind, and they can't understand why their taxpayers' money is going to fund the war in Ukraine. And if Trump gets in, God forbid, it's going to become much more difficult to get aid to Ukraine. Hence, I think more of the responsibility has to move to the European continent. After all, it's much closer to the war. But again, that's where much of these assets are frozen. And look, we all understand the concern of Belgium and others that this may call into question the reputation of, Euroclear and of the reliability of the euro. But what's worse, having a bit of a dent to your reputation, or Mr. Putin being allowed to go further into Europe, damaging economies, creating havoc worldwide? The other thing I'll quickly say is that the Russians have developed a very, very, I would say even impressive playbook of causing chaos around the world, destabilizing democracies without firing one shot. Things these days can be done by cyber attacks and other means, undermining elections, that sort of thing. So we cannot, as a civilized society, let our eye off the ball here. We have to do everything it takes to push Mr. Putin back.
And just to go back to that what you were talking about before, about this scorched earth kind of tactic policy, whatever you want to call it. You've said earlier that Putin, you can't underestimate his thirst for territorial expansion. How much of the country do you think he is prepared to destroy in the process of this war?
Well, it's a very good question. It sends a chill down my back just to think of it. Look, I'm normally based in Odessa, a beautiful city which was built by many different nationalities, and which is, at the end of the day, a crucial component of the global food supply chain. We see almost on a daily basis now Russian missiles and drones coming our way, and it's caused a lot of panic, a lot of anxiety. You know, and I'm really sad to tell you this, but people in Odessa who have been part of the building of modern Odessa or the foundation of it are either leaving or thinking of leaving. And I think the Russians know exactly what they're doing by these scare tactics. So it's not only scorched earth policies or approaches, it's also causing fear and panic throughout the country. The Russians are also developing new tactics. When they do fire drones and missiles, they basically take a circuitous route around Ukraine. So they set off alarm bells throughout the country, including in the middle of the night, and that causes a lot of disruption. We only have to look what the Russians have done in other theaters, for example, in Syria and Chechnya and elsewhere, to know how far Mr. Putin will go. This is a regime that doesn't think twice about even killing its own people for its own purposes and blaming it on others. So he's not to be underestimated, but it is very, very sad. Again, going back to Kharkiv to see what is going on in this beautiful city, just so much destruction, and nothing is off the table for the Russians. Churches, museums, places of worship, civilian apartment buildings. It's very, very sad.
Yeah, and how further does that ambition go? How far does it extend to including the erasing of civilians, culture, identity in Ukraine? I mean, you were talking earlier about how at that conference that you've been at, you were saying it's really important to show the Ukrainian people who they are and what they are. I presume that's like a countermeasure to what you see is going on in Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, well, what was said at that conference as well is that we are seeing history repeat itself in Ukraine. Russian aggression, the liquidation of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, the forced man-made famine under Stalin of 1932-33, that is happening right now. We had a session, for example, on ecocide, what Russia is doing to the environment in Ukraine, blowing up dams, mining agricultural fields on a scale never seen before, chemical attacks, cluster bombs, you name it. It's causing massive destruction to the environment in Ukraine, which will take generations for it to recover. So I think that's has to be a key part of kind of the Ukrainian strategy, is to bring to life these attacks and how they impact upon people, how they're destroying the culture. We also had a session, by the way, of what happens behind the scenes in seized territory, for example, in the Donbass, how the Russians have a very, very developed playbook of changing curriculums and replacing Ukrainian radio and TV with their own channels. So it's something that is happening on a kind of industrial scale in Ukraine, but not very well understood by the West.
What do you think the West needs to understand about it?
Well, I think they need to understand is the brutality, the extent to which Russia will go. Let me give you an example, if I may. I mean, I remember in the first few months of the war, we saw the attacks starting on Mariupol, for example, that theater where women and children were taking shelter. Hundreds died in a Russian strike there. But it was that particular strike on a maternity hospital in Mariupol, which was apocalyptic in nature. It was probably a 500-pound bomb that landed on the grounds of that hospital. And you saw that kind of iconic image now of a pregnant mother being taken out on a stretcher. She ended up dying, and so did her child. I look at that photo and I want to vomit. It's just so horrible. But the reason it gets me so angry is because you would have thought that would have been a red line way back earlier in the war. But we're seeing red line after red line after red line being crossed, and this only emboldens not only Mr. Putin, but other autocrats as well. Where does it end, and how far? I guess at the end of the day, what people should understand is that the type of destruction, apocalyptic destruction we're seeing in Ukraine, if Mr. Putin is not restrained, he will bring that level of destruction to other neighboring countries. That will, if it's a NATO country, that will require U.S. and other allied troops on the ground, and will become much, much more costlier.
When you talk about red lines being gone over again and again and again, as a person yourself who has a keen interest in humanitarian work and by extension, I believe, human rights, one of the most overlooked tragedies of the war is this treatment of children forcibly removed from Ukraine to Russia. Why is it the world seemingly is numb to this, and there hasn't been more of an outcry and outrage about it?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Look, I'm a former global spokesperson for UNICEF. I represented UNICEF in the West Bank and Gaza. And, that's a type of ongoing burning conflict, which has peaks and lows, if you want to call it that. And I remember very well, way back then in the day, telling people what children are going through in that particular crisis. And there are many reasons that this numbness has, if we want to call it that, has taken over. But I think one reason is that those who are supposed to be speaking out on behalf of children's rights have kind of lost the microphone. And I don't think they're making the argument forcefully enough. But going back to the situation in Ukraine is it's children's catastrophe by any way you look at it. Not only the forced deportation of thousands and thousands of children to Russia, where they're forcibly adopted, where they're forcibly brought into this very Russian patriotic curriculum, but also what they're facing on the ground in Ukraine, the disruption to their education, the disruption to their play. There was one video we played at the conference that everyone saw, and it was about it showed a boy, perhaps 10 years old, being interviewed by a TV reporter just after his playground had been struck by a Russian missile. And he said, I never thought I'd see the day that this would happen to my own play area. I saw the destruction of Bucha, of churches there, but now it's happening to us. And that look in his eyes, the tone of his voice is something I've seen in other conflict areas, for example, in the Gaza Strip. And it's so sad because overnight, these young, innocent, beautiful children are being forced to take on kind of the demeanor of an adult. You can see the darkness in their eyes as well, but also, you realize that their youth has been abruptly brought to an end, and what kind of future are they going to face? And one more point, I spend so much time in Ukraine, and I go to cemeteries on purpose to see, for example, how much they've expanded over the course of a few months, and some of them have reached capacity. If you go to many villages in Ukraine, there are no men there anymore. If you travel throughout Europe or even here in the United States, you see Ukrainian mothers and their children on the go seeking safe shelter. So I make this point because imagine what it's doing underneath the surface to the social fabric of Ukraine, these split up of families. And again, this is not something that is going to bounce back overnight once hopefully there's a peace deal. So it's very, very sad to watch.
It's really interesting because there are going to be these peace talks in Switzerland taking place next month. And Zelensky is urging countries like China to take part. At those peace talks, it seems strange that there is a concept of having peace talks at this point. But is it more about what do you do afterwards, about the reconstruction? What kind of things might be talked about there?
Yeah, I think this is a meeting where we probably keep our expectations low, but hope for the best. 160 countries were invited. I think we're at over 50 now that have accepted. The Ukrainians in the host country are putting forth a very deliberate effort to attract countries from the global south, but it doesn't look like Brazil will be taking part. China probably won't be at the table. I'm unsure about India, South Africa. We're talking about members of that BRICS coalition. It's very, very important that they be there. Ukraine has somewhat belatedly put emphasis on working more on the global south, getting African countries involved, Central South American countries, because at the end of the day, a lot of these issues are voted on, for example, in the UN General Assembly and in subcommittees and things like that. So it's very important to have them as part of this. But it's going not too badly. Half of the countries that are going to be attending are non-European countries. We're also going to be watching out at what is going to be the level of representation of the respective countries. There's talk that this happening so soon after the G7 summit in Italy that perhaps President Biden will detour and attend the summit as well. So this isn't going to be remarkable if we're not at least at the level of foreign ministers or leaders of the representative countries. But whether it will end up in a sudden peace for Ukraine, I doubt it. Russia is not going to be at the table, but it will signal to the Kremlin, to Moscow, that these countries that are attending, and again, hopefully at a very high level, are in support of Ukraine, are in support of a peace treaty. And then, China, I said this the other day, Xi Jinping is one of the few global leaders that has the ability to pick up the phone, call Mr. Putin and say, bring an end to this now. China has not done that. China can't even bring itself to call this for what it is, a war. They call it a crisis, the Ukraine crisis. So it's very, very important that China have a look at itself in the mirror and start calculating the cost to world instability, to grain corridors, that sort of thing, and take a more principled stance.
Isn't it, though, more urgent for Ukraine's allies to agree what victory should look like and define a strategy to get there so that all its allies can get behind it?
Yeah, absolutely. And, the Zelensky government has a 10-point peace plan that includes the complete withdrawal of Russian troops, the return of POWs, territory to be returned. The Ukrainians have, and very, very understandably, quite a strong position, and that is that all of these territories have to be, that are occupied, have to be returned to Ukraine, including Crimea. Many analysts don't see that happening. And I think the Russians, their strategy is kind of a war of attrition. They want to wear down Ukraine. They want to wear down the West so that eventually they have a stronger position at the bargaining table. But I asked, again, Ambassador Koslitsa, if he had the opportunity, like the Palestinians and the Israelis did way back in Oslo, to go into a room together, put aside their differences, and talk about a path to peace. He said, well, I'm actually doing that most days. I'm in, the UN General Assembly or in the Security Council, and I see Russia right there. But his answer, I agree with him, said, well, we could talk, but at the end of the day, it's the kind of attitude, the mindset of the Russian people that isn't going to change, that they allow their government to do this type of aggressive behavior. So there's a lot of different aspects to achieving a path to peace. I think also Turkey, their role is going to be very, very important, as a broker, not only as a key kind of negotiator for peace between the Russians and the Ukrainians, but also as a guarantor for peace as well.
I just wanted to ask you, because last time we spoke, you said you were very interested in documenting Russia's influence and growing influence in Africa. What have you seen since we last spoke?
Yeah, sure. Well, my goodness, it's on many, many different levels. For example, I was in South Africa, as you know, and you listen to the radio there, and a lot of the channels are just parroting what Mr. Putin said or what Russia Today said. We find that happening, by the way, very heavily in South America, where Russian propagandistic media channels have a very, very big influence. So there's that, but there's also the Russian race, interestingly, kind of in competition with China, to get to to get to African mineral resources, blood diamonds, that sort of thing, because these are exactly the sorts of things that fund the Putin war machine. The one thing I haven't been able to get a grasp on since that failed attempt by the Wagner Group to take over Moscow is to what degree has the billion-dollar machinery that the Wagner Group had to mine minerals in Russia, how much that's been disrupted by the assassination of their leader, Mr. Prigozhin. But you do have other entities connected to the Russian state, for example, through Gazprom, which are keeping that flow of money going. So a lot of Russian influence there. And of course, they have much, much more resources diplomatically to manipulate and to pressure and to threaten smaller, weaker African countries to vote a certain way, for example, in the BRICS setting or in the UN General Assembly. So huge influence there, and sadly, again, Ukraine is a bit late at the game in terms of putting itself forward more robustly on the continent and, developing friendships with potential allies there.
When you talk about Ukraine being a bit late to put itself out there, how much power, how much freedom do the media outlets in Ukraine have now, and how evolved are they?
Yeah, very good question. Well, look, we went into this war with a very poor state of affairs for the Ukrainian media. A lot of the main TV channels were owned by oligarchs, and a lot of the media channels did not have stable sources of revenue. Then the war came, martial law was declared, and the Zelensky administration kind of corralled the main channels into what's called a 24/7 telemarathon, which has served its purpose in terms of getting information out. But ratings have really fallen, and none of these channels are making revenue. The war has been absolutely so destructive on the media sector in Ukraine. We talked about this a lot at our Ukrainian journalist conference. For example, there's a huge human resource problem. Many journalists have been killed, well over 100. Many have been drafted or at the front line. Many have gone there to volunteer, and many have left Ukraine for safer haven. The number of newsrooms that have closed across the country are in the hundreds now. And also there's been massive destruction of physical infrastructure. So our argument, or our kind of effort right now is to help boost the Ukrainian media sector, to help them raise revenue, to set standards, and also to help them deal with their human resource problems. So we're looking at a number of things, creating alliances, for example, between Ukrainian journalism schools and schools here in the United States, for example, like Columbia. But we're also making the argument there's going to be another Ukraine reconstruction conference next month in Munich. And it boggles the mind that at none of these conferences the Ukrainian media sector is brought up. But our argument is that for all of these billions and billions of dollars to come into Ukraine for reconstruction, we first need a very strong, viable, independent media sector, because that's how corruption will be kept at bay. And by the way, businessmen, the last time I checked, need reliable information to make sound investments in a certain country. So we feel this is something that can be done fairly simply and fairly quickly while a peace deal is being forged ahead. It's very, very important that that happen.
Because it's also really important, I presume, that the messaging and the information, the control over the information war about how the war is going in Ukraine, who has the upper hand, who has the advantage, and the perception of that, that's going to heavily influence long-term support for Ukraine, and perhaps have an influence on, and we know that Putin is playing on this to make it look like, well, if we stick it out long enough, they're just going to give up. I mean, that whole messaging is absolutely crucial, isn't it?
It is, and the public opinion polling in Ukraine has indicated that actually most people in Ukraine would like the Zelensky administration to be more forthright, not sugarcoat everything as much as they did, so they can get a better grasp. I'll give you an example of that 2-year war anniversary press conference. Mr. Zelensky pegged the number of Ukrainian servicemen dead. I think it is around 31,000. A lot of people believe that number to be far, far higher. I think in terms of messaging, the Ukrainians have to do a better job, tinker with their messaging to say, this is actually what's happening. This is the level of destruction. Journalists have long since complained that their access to the front line is quite restricted. The penalties for Ukrainian media to overstep martial law reporting regulations are very, very severe. So it's imposed a kind of attitude of self-censorship, especially with Ukrainian media. But this is the reality of the world we live in, is that unfortunately people really have to see destruction up close and very vividly to make an impact. And I hope that message gets through.
And just finally, Michael, you've described yourself as an honorary citizen of Odessa, which you've made your home. How is life there now? How optimistic are your fellow citizens about it and Ukraine's future?
Yeah. Whenever I go back to Odessa, and I can't wait to go back, I am just, amazed by the level of civility, of kindness that are shown to people like myself. Even during this time of war, I told you about how these air raid sirens keep people awake through the night. But they have taken it on board. They realize that this is part of warfare, that we have to keep on going. We have to keep our businesses alive. A lot of people hope that, tourism will eventually start coming back to that region. It's very, very important. So people are very resilient. But having said that, there are very, very strong people that I referred to earlier in the interview who have to take a break and are leaving. And I do fear that this will have a kind of a cumulative effect on the economy there. You know, a lot of Ukrainians are, when they wake up in the middle of the night and they hear these Russian missiles go off and drones over their heads, they go, where is the Western support? Where are those Patriot missile systems that are meant to defend us? And everyone in Odessa realizes that they are living in a port city. This port city, as I said, is a crucial component of the global food supply chain. And why is it that the West has not even given a fraction of the aid, of the defense that it's given to the Red Sea to protect those shipping lanes? Why isn't it doing the same for these very crucial grain corridors? Having said that, there is good news to share with you. I mean, the last time I was at the port, not that long ago, there were a lot of ships lined up carrying grain, but for the first time since the start of the war, containers are starting to be moved as well. And of course, this is really, really important because Ukrainian roads and rail systems are overwhelmed with container traffic. If they can shift a lot of that back, it will not only improve Ukraine's economy, trade, impact positively world markets, but it also bring a lot more employment back to Odessa. When you live there as long as I do, you realize how far the tentacles go throughout the city of that port, that it's the lifeblood of Odessa in many ways. So that is something that is really, really great to see, is that revival of that port.
Michael, really good to catch up with you. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.